Welcome to webbikeworld.com. This is a video illustrating the video quality of the new Garmin VIRB action camera. Be sure to read the full review with all the details on webbikeworld.com. We're a little disappointed with the video quality of the Garmin VIRB for three reasons. First, it seems to have a narrow dynamic exposure range, so the highlights can become blown out or overexposed when the camera is in the shadows, as you can see in the sky in this video. The sky was perfectly clear blue on this day, but a combination of the limited exposure range and the camera's bias for overexposing the shadows by a couple of stops ends up blowing out the highlights. Second, the color rendition of the camera is a mixed bag. With the overexposure comes washed out colors. And finally, the camera seems to have an overall magenta or blue tint, which comes and goes depending on the exposure. But in other instances, the colors are oversaturated and can look a little unnatural, which can be seen in the blue sky, although it's not as bad as the Sony Action Cam we reviewed on webbikeworld.com. You can see how the sky becomes overexposed to a point where it is completely blown out at some points when the camera is in the shadows. We think this is caused mostly by a combination of narrow exposure range and a bias towards overexposing the shadows. I'll pause the video here because this frame illustrates how the sky has become completely overexposed while the camera tries too hard to bring up the light in the shadows. If it brought the shadows down a couple of stops, there might be a bit more headroom at the bright end for the highlights. I'll speed up the video a bit, and further down the road you can see that the sky is actually completely blue on this day without a cloud. The exposure is a little better here once we're out of the shadows. This road is bumpy because it's a back road, but something we also notice on the Garmin VIRB is that it has more vibration than some of the other motorcycle video cameras, and this is despite the fact that the Garmin VIRB has a switchable image stabilization feature that doesn't seem to make that much of a difference. Here's a smoother secondary road, but you can still see a bit of jitteriness here. It's another example of how the camera overexposes the sky when it's in the shadows, again biasing the exposure towards bringing up the shadows, which causes the highlights to get blown out. It's not only the sky that has problems. Note the field on the left is actually a greenish brown but becomes completely overexposed. Okay, so let's take a look at the different field of view settings. This is the wide view at 720p at 60 frames per second. There are three choosable field of view selections on the VIRB, and here's the narrow view, also at 720p and 60 frames per second, but there isn't really that much difference. And here's the narrow field of view at 1080p at 30 frames per second. Here you can also see the white banding between the slightly oversaturated colors on the ground and the blue sky. The Garmin VIRB also has an interesting slow motion mode at 120 frames per second at 480p. It's kind of hard to tell here because there aren't many other speed references, but this is about 45 to 50 miles an hour. Here are some cars coming from the other way, also traveling about 45 miles per hour, making the slow motion more apparent. Here's a state highway, so the road surface is relatively smooth, and we quickly get up to 65 or 70 miles per hour here. The video quality isn't too bad, just that it's not as good as we'd like for the amount of money they charge for the VIRB. The overexposure issue can still be seen, and also the color tint isn't quite correct. It seems to change quite noticeably depending on the exposure. Hopefully Garmin will fix these issues in a firmware update. There's also some vibration or jitters that we don't notice on other cameras. Finally, we did a comparison between the Garmin VIRB and the Midland XTC 300 VP4 action camera that we reviewed this spring on webbikeworld.com. The Midland XTC 300 is around half the price of the Garmin, but we think it has better overall video quality with more accurate colors, a wider dynamic range, and smoother video. We also think it's lighter and easier to mount. It's a nice camera for the money, so be sure to read the full webbikeworld.com review of the Midland XTC 300. Here's our favorite video cam test road with the Midland. You can see that the color rendition is natural and the exposure has a wider range with blacker shadows. The video also seems to have an overall smoother quality than the Garmin VIRB. Here's the Garmin VIRB. The sky becomes oversaturated when the exposure compensates for the light, and the greens and reds are also a little oversaturated. Here's the Midland again. The colors are more natural and the video seems smoother. Back to the Garmin VIRB, the colors are more saturated to a point where the sky occasionally looks unnatural. Let me pause for a second here. You can see the sky is blown out again and the colors now become faded. To compare, here's the Midland and the colors are more natural and the exposure range is wider. By the way, it's important to note, as always, that the quality of these videos after uploading to YouTube will be quite different from the raw video viewed directly from a camera on your computer. Here's a comparison going back the other way on this road. Now the sun is overhead about 1 o'clock. Here's the Garmin. The colors aren't too bad here, although a bit oversaturated, but you can see when the exposure changes that the saturation changes also, and the magenta or purple blue tint comes in and out. I'll pause the video here and you can see that the colors are a little washed out and the purplish tint is apparent. Here's the Midland. The colors are more natural with more green in the trees, as is correct, and the road is the correct slate color. Both cameras have some lens flare issues, as do most action cams due to the wide angle of the lens. Here's the Midland again. The video seems smoother, which is another plus of this camera. So that's a look at some on-road video from the Garmin VIRB. For more information, more photos, and all of the details, please read the full review on webbikeworld.com. Thanks for watching.